On today's episode of Locked On Wild, Shane Pinto thinks Matt Boldy is in for a big one this year, and I tend to agree. We'll preview the 2024-2025 season for Matt Boldy on today's episode.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll take a look at Matt Boldy's 2024-2025 season projection, some stats, reasonings as to why his performance should receive a nice bump this year, as well as best fits in the lineup. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and for the everydayers of our show, this is going to seem like a little bit of rehashing because recently we talked about why Matt Boldy is, it seems like, trending towards having a big season for the Minnesota Wild this year. And the reason I wanted to go with Boldy today was because a tweet from last night caught my eyes. Michael Russo tweeting out last night, because he is taking part in the NHL, player media days going on in Las Vegas, and so had a chance to talk to many of them. Here is what Russo had to say. After playing with Minnesota Wild's Matt Boldy at Worlds, Sens youngster Shane Pinto expects him to pop. This year, he's going to get like 90 to 100 points. The way he protects the puck, he's 6'2", he shoots it hard, he's smart, fast for that big of a guy. It's not going to be a breakout year because he already put up 69 points, but I think he could definitely take the next step. And with where we're at in the process, how much fun would that be? Because I think it's pretty easy to say that Locked On Wild is pro Matt Boldy, while also saying that we would like to see him continue to build up the ladder. I don't know why it is in particular, but it seems like there is a lot of Matt Boldy critique on social media. And you look at what he has done as a youngster throughout the course of his career. He is going to be heading into his age 23 season. He already has 75 goals and 171 points in 203 career games. And, we talked about, when we looked at this, him being one of the top scorers in his draft class at this point. And a player who is a perennial, right now, a perennial 30-goal scorer at 23 years old. That's hard to come by, and it feels like he is going to be adding different pieces to his arsenal as he continues to grow. Later on in the show, we'll talk about how he is starting to accumulate defensive value as well. But the thing that Matt Boldy is really known for at this point in his career is being a high-end scorer. He's done that every single year that he has been a member of this Minnesota Wild team, and it has featured incremental improvements every season so far throughout his career. You look at what Boldy did this past season, 29 goals and 40 assists in 69 points in 75 games. He was a +5 on the season. He had 10 power play goals, 25 total power play points. His shooting percentage increased from last year to this year, a career high in time on ice, a career high in total shot attempts, a lot of different areas in which Boldy improved his game from a 31 goal, 63 point output in 2022, 2023 as a 21-year-old to keep that incremental improvement going. Because at the rate he was going, had Boldy not missed those 7 games, it's another 30-goal season for Boldy this year to keep pace with what he did last season. Now, you kind of have to view Matt Boldy's season as 2 parts, because obviously, and it wasn't specifically Matt Boldy who was the culprit as to why the Wild struggled as badly as they did in the early part of the season. But when you have as many things going wrong as the Wild did, it all adds up. And it leads to a lot of questions as to, what is specifically causing this type of a start. But you look at Boldy's numbers in the first 19 games of the season. He had 1 goal and had 8 points. Not ideal. Not an ideal start for Matt Boldy. Now, he didn't play all of those games because he was injured early on in the season, but in the last bit of the Dean Evason era, Boldy had 1 goal on the season. If you look at what he did from November 27th to the end of the season, and we'll talk about what all led to this surge in production from November 27th to the end of the season. That was the John Hines tenure. Matt Boldy was 28th in the entirety of the NHL in points with 61. He had 28 goals and 33 assists in the final 63 games of the season. So he was slightly below a point per game player over the final 63 games. And those 61 points were better than Elias Pettersson of the Vancouver Canucks, Brady Tkachuk of the Ottawa Senators, Steven Stamkos of the Tampa Bay Lightning, and several other notable names that were below him on the list from that point to the end of the season. And so, yes, we acknowledge that there was a slow start to the year for Matt Boldy, but you look at how he finished, and there is hope that if he is able to avoid that type of a lull at the beginning of the season, that his production should reflect what happened at the end of the year. And we'll talk about what those numbers exactly look like. That leaves a high level of intrigue. And then you add into the fact that some of Boldy's teammates on the World Championship team, who had a chance to see him play pretty much all season, he was tied for most points in the tournament, by the way, and played on the top line for that U.S. team all the way through. So you have some other NHL guys that are looking at his performance in that tournament and saying, "Geez, he is he's trending in the right direction." And I can't say exactly which show it was, but at one point during the offseason, Michael Russo was talking with Dan Barrero on KFan, and he noted 2 players specifically who have been in the weight room a ton this offseason. Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy. So and it's funny because at the end of last season, there were the reports that Bill Guerin had a real heart-to-heart with Boldy about how his season went. And I think a lot of it centered around what happened at the beginning of the season and trying to avoid those types of lulls in production. But if we sit here right now, having Matt Boldy just put in a full weight program in the offseason, looking the part even as far back as the World Championships, which were in May, which was pretty close to after the season ended. That's another reason to expect that we could be in for a monster Boldy year this year. But a lot of it depends on where he gets put in the lineup. And I know for the everydayers, we talked about this a couple weeks ago in just looking at the potential for Boldy to have a breakout campaign. But we're going to take a look at the line combinations because there has been some steam that we could see a little different line combos than what we saw to end of the season. So when we come back, we'll talk about Matt Boldy's best fits on this Minnesota Wild team and what can really maximize him and turn him into just a force for this Minnesota Wild team. We'll talk about all that as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, we are in the thick of the fall sports season. College football, the NFL, and the playoff push for Major League Baseball give you a lot of options to go see your favorite team in action. And especially on the college football front, an opportunity to go tailgate and enjoy the game beforehand. And Game Time wants you to spend all of your energy worrying about enjoying the game, enjoying the experience before and after. They'll make buying tickets absolutely a breeze. Plus, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we will have a live show for you tonight at 8 p.m. Denny is going to start with his player reviews for the Minnesota Wild roster, as well as discussing whether Minnesota Wild coaches past and present coached players up or coached players down. So it should be a great time. 8 p.m. tonight on YouTube. Make sure to join us for all of the fun. Continuing today's episode, looking at Matt Boldy's 2024-2025 season and what we can expect from the talented scoring wing. Now, a lot of Matt Boldy's production depends on which line he is going to be put with this season. And I'll throw out the numbers for you because there is a pretty solid disparity between the two most likely combinations that we're going to see. So, last season, at about the right around the All-Star break, after the All-Star break, the Minnesota Wild deployed a new formation to lead the lineup. Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Kirill Kaprizov. And here are the numbers. That line combination played 374 minutes, just under 375 minutes together. Their expected goals percentage was 62.9. 62.9% of the time that a goal was scored while that combination was on the ice, 63% of the time it was that trio that was scoring the goal. They came in at an expected goals for per 60 minutes of 3.63. Let me say that again. An expected goals for per 60 minutes of 3.63. And the expected goals against is pretty good too. Their expected goals against per 60 minutes was 2.14 while they were put together. And, you know, these combinations are based on A minimum of 100 minutes played together, and that combination is best by far. If we even go down to 10 minutes, there are hardly any combinations that played any sort of meaningful roles and were able to best what we saw there. Although 11.4 minutes played together between Liam Ogren, Murat Huznadinov, and Kirill Kaprizov, and the expected goals for that trio was 6.86, which is that's a lot. But amongst your regular combinations, right around 100 minutes or more, that Boldy, Eriksson Ek, Kaprizov combination, just impossible to beat. The numbers that they put up, they were at the top in pretty much all statistical categories once that trio came together. The other combination that at least, and I shouldn't say that this has been rumored. People don't really know what to expect from the roster at the top. We've heard rumblings that the team is looking at starting Kirill Kaprizov, Ryan Hartman, and Matt Zuccarello together with an effort to try to get Matt Zuccarello to a more productive version of himself. The points just were not there at the end of last season after this trio came together. And so the thought process is these three guys at the top are all very good. Let's try to spread them out so that we can get two lines that are capable of scoring. And so if you go the Kaprizov, Hartman, Zuccarello route, that means Boldy and Eriksson Ek are going to stay together. And then who ends up being on that wing spot is basically where we've been at for the last couple of seasons. Marcus Johansson has place held in that spot. But look at the numbers for that trio compared to Boldy, Eriksson Ek, and Kaprizov. In 225.9 minutes together, the expected goals is 53.2. So you got about a 9% bump down in expected goals percentage. The expected goals for separation, expected goals for is 9.2 for Boldy, Eriksson Ek, Johansson, and expected goals against is 8.1. So you have a 1.1 expected goals disparity between the two. Boldy, Eriksson Ek, and Kaprizov, the expected goals for was 22.7. The expected goals against 13.4. So now you're talking about nine expected goals difference between those two line combinations. Expected goals per 60 minutes. Boldy, Eriksson Ek, Johansson, 2.44. Their expected goals against, still very solid at 2.15. But the expected goals for per 60 minutes, 2.44. And then Kaprizov, Hartman, Zuccarello, they played 142 and a half minutes together last year. Their expected goals percentage was 48.6, so below 50%. Their expected goals for was 7. Their expected goals against 7.4. Their expected goals for per 60 minutes, 2.95, which is better than Boldy, Eriksson Ek, Johansson. But their expected goals against per 60 minutes was 3.12. And so I ask, is it worth it? Is it worthwhile to break up the wrecker line for an attempt at balance? I guess what I will say is this. Boldy, Eriksson Ek, Johansson, Kaprizov, Rossi, Zuccarello, or Kaprizov, Hartman, Zuccarello. Those two lines had a combined expected goals for of 16.2 and an expected goals against of 15.5. So Boldy, Eriksson Ek, and Kaprizov had more expected goals by themselves than that top six did. and fewer expected goals against than that entire top six by themselves. And so I'm just throwing this out there. Maybe what you do is you just try somebody in that second line spot as opposed to breaking up what is, I think, has been pretty established as a game changer type line for this Minnesota Wild team. And so just looking at the combinations, let's try Zuccarello, Rossi, and Hartman. They had an expected goals percentage of 65.9, so 66%. Their expected goals for was 2.7, expected goals against 1.4. So it's not giving you a lot of offense, but it is playing pretty good defense. And let's find, because I'm pretty sure they got some run together this past season. And then we'll shift back to Boldy. But part of trying to figure out where Matt Boldy's success and role lies is who he's going to be playing with. And so the other combination that you would likely be looking at is Matt Zuccarello, Marco Rossi, and, for instance, I'll just throw in Liam Ogren. And I was pretty sure that, but I'm not seeing any data here on Money Puck for that combination. Maybe I'll try this by minutes played and see if it comes up there. But basically what we're looking for is, like, you can keep that top line together and just see if somebody in that second line wing spot is capable of increasing the performance, of upping the performance of that second line, to where then you say, well, yeah, we don't have to break up the top three. Now we have a second line that can work as well. And so, the moral of the story here is Matt Boldy will be a top six guy, but I think his projection infinitely higher if he is playing on the top line than if he is playing in a middle or a second line spot. And so a lot of that depends on what is done to fill that magical void on the second line. We'll take a look as far as projections for Matt Boldy and spots he can help the lineup, and try to put together a little bit of an over-under for him as well. All coming up as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Indeed. We are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Plus, listeners to this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, again, we've got the live show coming up tonight at 8 o'clock p.m. on YouTube. Denny will be talking about some player reviews, going to go through the entirety of the roster over the next few weeks. So we'll get that started tonight. And we'll also talk about Minnesota Wild coaches and the notion of coaching up or coaching down. So 8 p.m. tonight. Make sure to join us right here on YouTube. and we'll get the party started at that point. Also, a reminder, we are continuing to take submissions for the Locked on Wild sweepstakes, where you have the chance to win 2 tickets to see the Minnesota Wild take on the Columbus Blue Jackets on October 10th. So all you need to do is screenshot proof that you are subscribed to Locked on Wild on YouTube, and then email that to us with your name, lockedonwild@gmail.com. We have a healthy pool of entries so far, but we'll continue to take them here through the rest of the month, and then we will draw our winners in the early part of October. Full contest rules can be found in the description of today's episode. All right, continuing our discussion about Matt Boldy and what to expect from him for the 2024-2025 season. Let's take a look at ESPN Fantasy Hockey. And I like to do this because it just gives a baseline. Fantasy sports, is driven a lot by goals, points, shots. There are different categories that make a fantasy team successful, but it gives us a baseline as to what to expect. What's the people that do this for a living expect a player to do for the upcoming season. And so then I can take that and say, well, I think this or I think that, and that just gives us something to take a look at as we get closer to the season. So ESPN has this to say about Matt Boldy. Boldy is fresh off a solid, if unspectacular, year. A nice surge late in the season helped him finish with 29 goals and a career-high 69 points, 25 of those on the power play, in 75 games a season ago. Similar numbers to his second-year breakout campaign. The good news is that Boldy will play almost the entirety of this upcoming season at age 23. There's a real chance for increased production. As is, Boldy is a huge part of both the present and the future for the Minnesota Wild and a rock-solid mid-round fantasy pick on draft day. Hard to argue with any of that. And their projections are that Boldy is going to play in 78 games, 33 goals, 42 assists, so a bump to 75 points, a +8 on the season, and 29 power play points for the year. Average time of ice right around the same, 18:48. The thing that I like is they have Boldy projected to go from 227 shots on goal to 242. I'm highly in favor of that for Boldy because, as we talked about for the everydayers, as we talked about when we took a look at the likelihood that Matt Boldy has a breakout campaign, couple of areas that I think he can improve upon that will up his numbers. And one of them we talked about was one-timers, because there were a lot of instances in which it seemed like Boldy would take those cannon shots, especially on the power play, or even just on offense, would take those cannon shots from the right side faceoff circle and wouldn't get all of it or would just miss. And so if he is able to take what he did this past season, it was interesting because Boldy had more total shot attempts in fewer games played this past year than he did in 2022-2023, 507 to 486. But his shots on goal dropped from 255 in 2022-2023 to 227 this past season. And so that means still shooting at a high rate, just was not as accurate with those shot attempts as he was the previous season. And so if Boldy can get some work in on the one-timers, that's going to up his goals by a sizable amount. So that is number one. That's one reason in which he is going to be able to up his performance. Number two, we keyed in on this as well. He is trending towards being the number 2 option on the power play. You've got Kirill Kaprizov, who's always the go-to. You've got Joel Eriksson Ek, who's the net front guy. But we saw it at points last year where Kaprizov, if Matt Boldy glided over to that right side faceoff circle and Kaprizov took the play to the left, He's looking to make that bullet pass in front of the crease to try to set Boldy up for a one-timer. And so some of that rapport, some of that chemistry that they built at the end of last season, that's going to continue. That's going to stick with those two. Matt Zuccarello is not going to not factor in on the power play as much as people would like to see opportunities given to the young players. I don't see, and this was something that I think was discussed on Judd's Hockey Show. I don't see Bill Guerin taking Matt Zuccarello out of the top 6. I just don't. As much as I would like to see somebody else in that spot, I just don't see it happening. And that's a GM's decision. We'll talk more about Matt Zuccarello when we get to his preview, but he's going to still be on that top power play unit unless he just is completely unless his skills just completely erode to where he's unplayable on the ice. He's still going to be on that top unit. And so him and Kaprizov are still going to do their thing. But Matt Boldy he's rising on the list in terms of where his importance factors in on the power play. And, we look too on the defensive side, he's really starting to make some noise as well. He was second on the team in terms of total point shares. He was worth over 7 points by himself this past season. But you look defensively, he was 7th on the team in terms of defensive point shares for the season. And he was behind Jake Middleton, Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, Zach Bogosian, Brock Faber, Jonas Brodin. So amongst forwards, he was 3rd on the team behind his 2 line mates. And so he's adding defensive value as well, which is where these rumblings that he's going to impact the penalty kill have come in. Highly in favor of seeing if he is up to being able to help improve that unit. Because I think for the Minnesota Wild this year, having more guys capable of playing depending on who you're going up against, as opposed to trotting the same 4 out there every time, I think that is something that they need to look at this year. So Boldy helping out on both special teams units, being our hope is a top line guy. At worst, he's going to be the top option on the second line. And so regardless, he is still like a top 3 option on this team, scoring from a scoring perspective. So he's going to get a ton of opportunities again. If he can have a more even-keeled start to the season, can avoid a 19-game lull to start the year, he comes in healthy, that I think is going to be huge because I do believe that the injury, it took him a while to get back on track during the season. Because once he did, it was absolute gangbusters. And the fact that I think John Hines, one of the things that he did when he came in was recognize the importance of the Wild's, not trying to be a speed bump. They have need for speed and skill for sure. But by even switching and just trying to play a modern game as opposed to trying to play like we're going to slow you down, we're going to grind the pace of the game to a halt, that doesn't work. And so changing even the mentality of this team is that, even though in many cases we're outskilled out there, we still need to try to play a modern style. That helps Matt Boldy as well. And so all of these factors lead into, why it's not crazy to think that even with ESPN projecting Boldy at 33, I don't think it's crazy to think that he can go a bit higher, a lot higher than that, depending on how it plays out. Because the other number that I wanted to talk about today is Matt Boldy's Corsi numbers are just unreal. 64.3%. 64.3%. So the Corsi events even, which is shots on goal, and there are a couple of other things that are factored into that as well. It's basically the things that you do to try to score a goal. When you're doing more of them, it means you are possessing the puck more than your opponent. The disparity in Corsi events when Matt Boldy was on the ice was 1,948 to 1,082. So you're talking about an 800 point difference. And then the on-ice goals for, with Boldy on the ice, 110. The on-ice goals against was 58. So with Matt Boldy on the ice, you're essentially a plus 50. Now, his individual metrics as being plus minus was not as high, but I mean, the numbers just speak for themselves. And he is a player now who this past season was just under a 3-point player per 60 minutes. On-ice goals for of 4.7, on-ice goals against of 2.5. Folks, any way you slice them, the numbers are good. And so if Matt Boldy just improves in a couple of areas, he should have a monster season. And so the over-under for Matt Boldy for this year, I'm going to set it at the number of points he had this past season. 69 points. I'm taking the over because, the projection of 75 points, if he has a stretch where he takes over like he did when Kirill was injured 2 years ago, where he has like a 13-goal month, if he has one of those in addition to being consistent all season, monster year. You're talking maybe 40 and 80. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility, if what we have heard is true, that he spent the entire offseason in the weight room and teammates on the world championship roster say he just is insane. It all leads to the potential for a really big year. And the Minnesota Wild are going to need him to have one. So if he lives up to his end of the bargain, that's going to go a long way. That is our show for today. Let us know in the comments if you think Matt Boldy will go over or under 69 points for this upcoming season. We will see you for tonight's live show at 8 p.m. Make sure to join us then, and make sure to hit the like button so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Make sure to subscribe. We have content like this and more coming at you every single Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.